How much?
How much you gotta spend?
Frank, this is more than a month's salary.
Out here, it is all about our hustle.
Do you really have to take us to the station?
We're everywhere. We have been everywhere for a really long time.
Yes, work! Yes, work! Yes, work! Yes, work! No bad horse! No bad horse! Just that boss!
Thank you so much for listening. This is part 2 of a 2-part series about sex work in colonial Nigeria, based on the scholarly work of Saheed Adarinto, based on her book, When Sex Threatened the State, Illicit Sexuality, Nationalism, and Politics in Colonial Nigeria Between 1900 and 1958. Now, if you haven't already listened to the last episode, which is part 1 of a 2-part series, I highly suggest that you go back and do that. We cover some background information about colonial Nigeria, the city of Lagos, which is where most of this study occurred, and the dynamics of the impact of colonialism on sex work in Nigeria between 1900 and 1958. In part 1, we talked about sex work in broad terms, and we focused in on the autobiographical writings of one of the more popular sex workers during this period when she was writing in 1929, 1930. Now I want to focus in on this group of highly educated feminist Nigerian women that were writing, agitating on behalf of women's empowerment within colonial Nigeria. They had been advocating for the prohibition of prostitution as early as the 1920s because they believed that they believed two things. As bourgeois, elite, highly educated women, they believed that adult women that engaged in sex work were not entitled to the same kinds of protections of the state, that they had disempowered themselves, and they believed that young girls who came to prostitution were victims of exploitation, and that the solution to this problem was a welfare state solution of making sure that young women, young girls had access to education, housing, and the resources that they did so as not to debase themselves with this grotesque profession, was the basic philosophy of this group of elite women, which is familiar to anyone who studies sex work or has ever talked to a white feminist. These are women who are mostly Western educated. They're going to the United Kingdom. They're attending universities. Some of them are becoming medical doctors. Some of them are becoming doctorals, editors. This is a very public. This is a group of women who are breaking educational and professional boundaries for their gender. And it's a kind of selective modernity where they're latching on to Western education as the mechanism through which to achieve higher status, higher class for themselves as individuals, and also representing their class as women, as educated Nigerians. So they form, in addition to writing publicly about issues that they care about, abolishing prostitution is one of a long list of changes that they want to see made to their country in order to elevate the status of women. Now they're coming up against two predictable barriers to this. One is the chauvinism within their own culture. The national youth movement, a nationalist party of Nigerian men, believes that does not trust that a group of only women can achieve anything at all. They sort of characterize them as like a bunch of mouthy hens, essentially. The colonial state is, of course, a deeply patronizing state that characterizes these women as a volunteer group of uppity housewives, essentially, and completely dismisses, whitewashes, and minimizes the educational and professional achievements of these women. But they write very eloquently about their position and their hope for a brighter future where they achieve like a gender equality state. So they're summarily dismissed by Nigerian nationalists who in the 1920s and 1930s sort of begins this anti-colonial nationalist movement. These women, although they are bourgeois and tend to uphold parts of the colonial state, are asking for more support for women and girls, hoping to abolish prostitution through empowering women. Now, they are a lonely voice in the 1920s and the 1930s, where the colonial state is not interested in cracking down on prostitution because it doesn't seem to be a threat to the colonial state. They're interested in supporting the military and the merchant class, which, of course, love prostitution when it's regulated. So World War II creates like an existential crisis for the empire and all of its colonies. It redirects a massive amount of resources, which means there are fewer resources available for infrastructure upkeep, police officers, all of the accoutrements of colonialism, which of course is framed as a modernizing influence on Nigeria, because every colonialist thinks that they're doing a huge favor to the indigenous population that they're oppressing. There is a collective undermining of the colonial power as they are threatened as the global hegemon, which is something that happens in World War II. That's when the United States replaced them, in case anyone was following Western history. Within the colonies, there is an undermining of the patriarchal order that occurs when law and order breaks down. So you see an increase in the activities of the Boma boys. You see more people on the street. So it's at this point that the colonial state chooses to redirect their energy from tolerating, regulating prostitution to a prohibitionist model. This occurs at the same time as the medicalization of sex work, where the VD hysteria and panic takes on sort of a win the war effort rhetoric, and everything, the heat is just turned up on the rhetoric around this issue. So the colonialists hire a guy named Donald Faulkner to run a new organization called the CWO, their Colony Welfare Office. And what he is tasked with is policing girlhood sexuality. The colony begins to reframe themselves as the patriarch, as the minder of girlhood sexuality, in order to prevent the moral decay of the colony. And he hyper-focuses on this concept of trafficking and this concept of girlhood sexuality. So he uses the rhetoric of this elite educated group of Lagosian women to justify the criminalization of women, of young and older women. So the first thing that he does is he cracks down on hawking as the gateway drug to prostitution. Now, what's important to understand about Nigerian family economics is that young children, especially young women, hawking their goods in open markets and on the street was not just an important economic activity for families, but it's also the way that knowledge about the family business is passed down from one generation to the next. So young children standing on street corners selling whatever it is their parents make is the way that young women participate in the family economy and the way that they prepare themselves for the next step. Now, what the Lagosian women were asking for was more educational opportunities for women, which they hoped would lead to more professional opportunities. And instead, the Donald Faulkner and the CWO crack down on women being seen in public. So they get rid, or they try to crack down and criminalize girl hawkers between the age of 13 and 16, having a huge dent in their ability to participate in the family economy, which of course has the opposite effect in that it encourages more instead of less prostitution. The other thing that they do is crack down on unescorted women in the nightlife in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, as we as you may remember from the last episode, during the colonial era and the urbanization of this city, you see a huge increase in nightlife. You see music clubs, you see drinking establishments, you see places where this very young, vibrant city, people are coming together. Now, the elite Lagosian women were actually irritated by this uptick in exuberant nightlife because it meant that poor people were competing with them essentially over public space, and there was some, I'm going to call it whining about their inability to book charitable balls because they were competing with whatever like the jazz of the era was. So this group of elite women are writing essentially like a Miss Manners editorial on what's wrong with women of this generation. They see women conducting themselves in an unladylike fashion in these nightclubs and believe that that is contributing to the moral decay of society. They see young girls being exploited both within sex trafficking and also the hawking, I think, is an example of the discombobulating effects of the colonial economy displacing the indigenous economy, and the way that exploiters coming into a new economy sort of creates new populations of desperate and exploitable people, young girls being the most visible form of this, and the way that the colonial state is able to weaponize that characterization to justify this new infringement on the colonized life, right? So criminalizing hawking is one example of that. The other is this multi-decade crusade that Donald Faulkner and his ilk go on to control and change marriage rituals within Nigeria. Now, what's happening during this period of time is the cash economy changes the bride price for tribal marriage. Now, what used to be was the courting rituals would involve a multi-year long process where like agricultural farmland or domesticated animals or gifts would be exchanged between families, eventually culminating in a marriage between two people and also two families, because that's what marriage is everywhere. Now, the cash economy raised the bride price, creating this tension between like urban workers who had fled to the city for jobs and sort of rural patriarchs who were then accused of like bride price racketeering. Of course, it's all being influenced by the colonialists who were introducing this cash economy and messing with the economics of everything, bride price included. Now, some traffickers took advantage of the destabilizing effect of marriage rituals and were using money to quote unquote marry girls, bring them into the city and employ them in brothels. Now, this is a form of trafficking Donald Faulkner and the CWO capitalize on this to try to outlaw women coming into Lagos, period. They try to investigate and look for more documentation. And of course, anyone who's worked in any bureaucratic government knows that every piece of every piece of paper costs you money. This is a revenue source for the state, right? Like, you need a permit, and then you need a license, then you need a piece of paper with a stamp on it, and the stamp costs you 2 units or whatever. They try to raise the age of consent from 13 to 16 using a strange combination of racist pseudoscience. So the CWO cracks down on girl hawking, having a huge impact on the local economy. They get their sticky racist fingers all over marriage rituals that they don't respect and don't understand. And they essentially try to criminalize public women. So the elite Lagosian women, who had been asking for the prohibition of prostitution for decades now, look at the way that the colonialists are implementing this and say, whoa, whoa, whoa. We wanted more education for women. We wanted more economic opportunities for women. We didn't want to justify the police state cracking down on the freedom of movement for women, including young girls. We didn't want forced VD and virginity tests, which of course looks a lot like the Contagious Diseases Acts happening in England in the 1860s. And if you haven't listened to the Harriet Hicks episode, you should go back and do that to understand what a nightmare this is for the freedom of movement of women. And then more importantly, because there's such a breakdown in law and order of the colonial state, and there's this like ongoing churning of general social disruption, what happens is that the CWO empowers police officers to target women as easy bribing targets, where a police officer will find a woman on her way to the store or on her way to the train or on her way to, God forbid, a job, and say, if you don't want to be charged with prostitution, then you need to give me a bribe. And so this has a direct and immediate impact on not just prostitutes, which the Lagosian elite women had no problem targeting, but women generally and collectively. And so there are many, many stories that come out of these elite women themselves being targeted, which of course the chauvinistic, male-centered nationalist party are interested in putting women back in their place and blame the westernizing impact of education for the newfound uppityness of their women. And of course, the patriarchal colonial state, which is characterizing these elite women as like, I don't know, a bee in their bonnet and a problematic a problem to be dealt with, rather than, the person, the people with the answer to the problem. And this all culminates in a power struggle over whose responsibility it is and which tactics will be used to rehabilitate girls who are found to be in moral danger, whether these are young girls rescued from brothels or they're women in vulnerable and therefore exploitable situations. The Lagosian women wanted to create schools and places that these girls could go to learn, I don't know, things ranging from writing to knitting to medicine to music. The colonial state wanted to put them in homes essentially and exploit them for free labor. So it starts off as a cooperative relationship between the National Women's Party and these women collectives that are started by this group of elite women hoping to raise the profile and potential of Nigerian women through education and professional opportunities. It starts off as a cooperative relationship with Donald Faulkner and the CWO, but quickly devolves along very predictable racist colonialist instincts, where Donald Faulkner is hoping to use the state to control and limit the movement, freedom of expression of women. And these Lagosian women are hoping to increase the possibilities of freedom of expression, freedom of movement for women all over Nigeria. Now, and they don't have a lot of support with the nationalist movement, who is uninterested in increasing the individual autonomy of women, even though they are interested in increasing the political autonomy of Nigerians as opposed to their colonialists. Now, the way that this all sort of culminates in a fight over a house for delinquent girls. Now, the CWO initially promises the women that they will be the ones controlling this, but then Donald Faulkner eventually changes his mind, and rather than discussing this change of heart with these group of dedicated women who have been in the field working for decades on this issue, who are well versed in the social and cultural context and the impact of some of these dumb laws, like exactly what happens when you start fucking with marriage rituals and the hawking culture and forcing virginity tests on 14-year-olds and all of the policing violent nonsense that comes with criminalizing children in an effort to quote unquote crack down on prostitution. All of those suggestions are ignored, and the women are iced out of the process. And instead of hiring one of these incredibly educated, incredibly qualified Nigerian women to usher in policies that make sense, that might have a beneficial impact, instead a white woman is put in charge of this house and uses her racist ideology to create workhouse-like conditions for this group of women after a PR campaign about what saviors they are. Now, to longtime listeners of the show, people who are waking up to the colonial cloth of which our culture is made, all of this sounds very familiar. And unfortunately, it's a tale almost as old as the oldest profession. If you're looking for more in-depth analysis on this, I highly recommend the book When Sex Threatened the State, Illicit Sexuality, Nationalism, and Politics in Colonial Nigeria. I only covered some of the highlights that stuck out to me, an imperfect reader, but I think that looking at colonized states is a fascinating case study for the way in which a patriarchal, chauvinistic state attempts to use actual harm against women in order to justify curtailing our movement. Comparing Lagos in 1929, 1930, where well-known sex workers are publishing their stories in major newspapers that are getting book deals, where you don't have a criminalization of sex work. You also have, Lagosian women who are pursuing medical degrees and art degrees and becoming editors of newspapers and writing, and you see this sort of dynamic urban environment where lots of different kinds of women are having lots of different kinds of feelings and thoughts and going to things. Now, as you start to crack down on quote unquote the trafficking of girls, you see the criminalization of children, especially women, especially young girls who are no longer allowed to hawk their wares on the public square. You see an increase in police trying to limit the freedom of movement, accusing any woman out alone of being a potential prostitute and using her as either a victim, like a mark, basically, for an easy bribe, or rounding up women. You see the medicalization of sex and hysteria around venereal disease that leads to the Nigerian version of the Contagious Diseases Act, where at any given moment, a woman who is a potential threat to the state with her dangerous, disgusting body might be rounded up by a medical officer, a plainclothes police officer, or somebody posing as a police officer to take them in a room and give them a quote-unquote virginity test or venereal disease test. And you see the minimization and reduction of women's voices. Even the elite, highly educated Lagosian women who had been asking for the prohibition of prostitution the whole time are ultimately dismissed by the patriarchal state in favor of punitive punishment that only exasperates the problem that these Lagosian women were trying to solve. Thank you for listening to The Oldest Profession. Thank you to our patrons. Y'all are the best. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you, as always, to our brilliant producer, Justine McClellan. Consider checking out our Instagram, at Old Pro Podcast, to see tons of images of the old pros we talk about on the show. Go to Twitter, also at Old Pro Podcast, for the latest in sex worker events, activism opportunities, and, of course, snarky commentary on the news of the day impacting sex workers. Please rate and review us on iTunes. It's a small thing, but it helps a lot. It helps people find us because algorithms. If you're considering coming out as a sex worker to somebody in your life, try suggesting that they listen to the podcast. How they react to this is a pretty good litmus test as to whether or not they'll try to shame you for being an old pro. All of the growth of this podcast so far has been the result of word of mouth, so please keep telling your friends. If everyone tells just one person, we can double our numbers and reach even more old pros and allies. The more listeners we have, the more we can chip away at this stubborn stigma. And again, thank you so much for listening. This has been The Oldest Profession.